Hello and welcome to For Every Response, the podcast from Emergency Services Times. I'm Lana, Deputy Editor here. This episode is sponsored by MSA Safety. So today we're looking at the shift to electric vehicles across the emergency services, where we're at, what's holding things up, and what it's really going to take to make that transition work on the ground. Carl Christie is our guest. He's a senior fleet specialist at Cenex, which is an independent not-for-profit that's been supporting low-emission transport for almost 2 decades. Catherine sat down with him off the back of our Blue Lights Green Fleet report, which we published earlier this year. And that report was based on FOI responses from 100 services, and Carl helped to analyse the data and provide his expert context. So it made a lot of sense to follow up with a deeper conversation. What I really like about this interview is how clear and down to earth Carl is. He's worked in engineering, fuel cell technology and consultancy, and he brings that full picture view to the conversation. He talks about the progress that's been made, but also why EVs still feel quite out of reach for many response roles, and why trying to copy and paste private sector solutions doesn't always quite cut it in an emergency services setting. So there's some really useful insight here for anyone that's involved in procurement, net zero planning or fleet management. And it's a really great companion piece to the report, which, if you haven't read it yet, it's available for free on our website. But we hope you enjoy the episode.
Today, I'm delighted to be joined by Carl Christie, Senior Fleet Specialist for Cenex. Welcome, Carl.
Hi, Catherine. Thank you for inviting me to speak today.
It's great to speak to you. I'm delighted that you could join us today to talk about our recent report, Blue Lights Green Fleet, where you partnered with Emergency Services Times to look at how the emergency services are transitioning to an electric fleet. First up, let's find out a little bit about you and a little bit about Cenex. So perhaps tell us a little bit about yourself and about the organisation that you work for.
So I lead the fleet strategy team here at Cenex, and we work very closely with fleet operators to help them to navigate their transition to zero-emission vehicle fleets and infrastructure. We do that by being an expert partner throughout the transition process, all the way from helping them to establish their team and understand their current fleet operations better, through to implementing and deploying their first vehicles. And Cenex has been at the forefront of the low-emission transport industry for the last 20 years. We originally established in 2005 as the UK's first centre of excellence for low carbon and fuel cell technologies, and today we operate as a fully independent, not-for-profit consultancy and research technology organisation, covering everything from road transport through to more difficult to decarbonise sectors like construction, agriculture and marine.
Okay, and what brought you into the sector? What's your background?
So my background is in automotive engineering, which I studied at university. I then spent the best part of 10 years developing fuel cell technologies for low-powered automotive applications, and then about 8 years ago moved into the world of consultancy.
Right. Okay. So it sounds like you're in a good place, and I think a place which is the interest is growing and growing. It's definitely something that you see a lot in the newspapers and radio programs and TV programs. So it's good that we were able, with the Emergency Services Times, to explore this with our report. We published that on the 20th of March, where we shared what we had found through FOI requests, so Freedom of Information requests, asking 103 emergency services what they were doing, so how much they were spending, what they'd spent already on EVs, what they planned to spend in the future, what they were doing with them, and what their general plans were. So one of the findings from that report is that 13% of emergency services, their fleet is electric or hybrid. That's what they told us. It was 95% of those 108 services that told. So that's a pretty good number, I think. So I wanted to ask you, first of all, were you surprised at that number? 13 feels quite low, but I wonder, relative to other sectors and your experience in Cenex, whether actually it's not bad. So what are your thoughts on that?
I think firstly it was great to see such a strong response to the FOI and lots of good information in there. That surprised us slightly. I don't think we're particularly surprised at the headline numbers of the 13% having transitioned to hybrid or electric vehicles across the fleet. What we tend to see is there's a real willingness to make this change and an appreciation of the scale of the challenge, but there's just so many additional considerations for how you operate emergency service vehicles compared to a normal fleet that it's probably reasonable at this stage of the transition for that to be a slow and steady transition at this point in time.
And why did you decide to partner with us for this report? I mean, I did all of the FOIing and we kind of talked about it as we went along. But in terms of Cenex and what it's the motivation for being partnered with us for this report and having done that, what it's told you about the emergency services, has that been a good thing for you to have done?
So there's two motivations really. So firstly, we've worked a lot with the likes of NHS England, several of the ambulance trusts and individual fire and rescue services and police forces over the last couple of years. And we were really keen to see whether our work helping them to develop and deliver their own strategies was highlighting the same challenges and issues that we were seeing at a more national level, and therefore what potential solutions there could be with that. And then I think the second aspect was to be able to do that with yourselves as an expert voice and a trusted voice within the blue light sector was what made it really exciting.
Oh, good. Well, I like those words. That's a great response. So in terms of now that we've done the report, we're going to go into a little bit more about it. But just in terms of how it stacks up against other sectors, you've done that work, as you said, with the other parts of the blue lights. Do you think that the emergency services, are they in the right kind of? Think about the time scales. I think about other things going to 2030, 2035, and we're going to come on to that. Do they feel like they're behind the curve?
I think there's an interesting split. If you look at the non-response aspect, the more general purpose vehicles of the emergency services, they're probably well in line with other similar public sector organisations like councils, and obviously the UK government has a target to get to a zero emission fleet by 2027. It's really when you make that differentiation between the more difficult response vehicles, things like your ambulances, fire appliances, high performance vehicles, where suitable EVs just haven't been available to date and the infrastructure isn't in place to support them. More broadly, I think where there's been much quicker progress has been in the private sector fleet operators, particularly those with the some of the largest fleets in the UK and globally. And just recently, the Climate Group published its progress report on its EV100 initiative, which showed that 70% of their members said they were on target to achieve full electrification by 2030. And that's really interesting because that covers some of the large fleets like Aviva, Costain and Mighty that have all converted more than 70% of their fleets to EVs. And just at the end of last year, Mighty had added their 6,000th EV to the fleet as well. So I think they're on track compared to the industry they're within, but there are examples of how more can be done in the right circumstances, I think.
Yeah, so in terms of those fleets you've just described, are those fleets the big vehicles, the HGVs, the larger ones?
Typically the smaller cars and vans delivering kind of our services that we use on a day-to-day basis as well. I think in terms of HGV fleet decarbonisation, we're starting to see some good progress with that, with government funded trials and deployments at the moment, but generally that's a step further behind the car and light commercial vehicle market.
Okay, so you mentioned ambulance just now. I was impressed by the ambition from NHS England about the rollout of fleet of ambulances, which we talk about in the report, where they're looking to see up to 80 on the streets by March 2026. Why do you think they can do that, and yet we don't see the same for fire engines or high-performance police cars? Is there something about what NHS England is doing, and whilst it might be called something in the future, the work hopefully will still continue, is there something particular that we can learn from how they've done it that police and fire could learn from in terms of their kind of difficult, their wicked problems of vehicles?
So I think obviously having NHS England as an organisation that is sat across and helping to fund and support the ambulance trusts is really important. But they've also done some really fantastic work to develop their national specification for electric ambulances, and then worked really closely with Ford and the vehicle converters to get a solution that meets their specific requirements and has been thoroughly trialled and tested before being deployed in frontline operations like with London Ambulance Service and others. It's interesting as well because the base vehicle, a large panel van, essentially, that is then converted into an ambulance, is perhaps closest to its intended use as an ambulance. A van is designed to carry equipment or people and patients, and if you compare that to something like a high-performance car, a high-performance version of a standard EV that might be used for the police, for things like traffic and armed response vehicles, the vehicles just haven't been there yet in terms of the priorities of the OEMs as being the passenger market, not necessarily the specialist high-performance market. And then in contrast to that, as you start to get to the heavier specialist applications like fire appliances and other specialist vehicles, these are really highly specialized converted versions of base HGVs. So you need to see vehicles coming onto the market from the likes of Scania, DAF, Volvo, Renault, Mercedes, the big truck manufacturers, and then you need to bring the body and the equipment suppliers to the market to be able to convert those vehicles into the specialist applications that fire need in particular as well. So it's almost like the perfect coming together of a proactive approach from NHS England, but also good availability of vehicles that can meet the requirements today.
That's interesting. So on the fire side, we know there are, in the report, we talk about 2 electric fire engines, one in Scotland, one in London from Emergency One. I was talking to somebody after the report about work in Berlin, where they have fire engines being developed there. Do you think there's much to be learnt from Europe or other parts of the world in terms of how we can move forward faster on the fire side, particularly?
I think so. It's certainly worth Fire and Rescue Services keeping a watching brief on those deployments to understand, particularly from an operational perspective, what those vehicles are doing, but also what the services are doing to accommodate them better into their operations, how they're charging them, when they're charging them as well. But the UK still remains quite a unique market as well, just in terms of having a requirement for right-hand drive vehicles, a number of OEMs that have traditionally dominated the fire market historically and will still be in a position whereby they're an important player in the transition as well. And then at the same time, each individual service and the sector as a whole faces its unique challenges with policing, providing healthcare and providing fire and rescue services in the UK context as well.
Okay, so when we look at Scotland in the report, we find that they came out on top in terms of how much they'd spent in the Scottish Ambulance Service, the Scottish Police, so Police Scotland, and the Scottish Fire and Rescue Service. They're all three were at the top of the league when it came to how much they'd spent on their electric fleet so far. And numbers we had were to November 24. Is there something to be said for being a whole country service in terms of your ability to move and make decisions and get to where we need to be? Do you see that? Do you think that's an advantage?
I think it certainly helps to break down some of those internal organisational barriers that might be facing some of the individual services in England in particular, just from the point of view of having one consistent voice and approach with regards to, I guess, the entire process of how vehicles are procured, how infrastructure is procured, how those assets are deployed, operated, maintained, and then ultimately disposed of at the end of life as well. And we are starting to see some examples, I think, of good collaboration in England, particularly through people like the regional procurement services. There's a couple of examples for the police in particular with the likes of South West Police Procurement Services and Seven Forces strategic collaboration in the east of England. But I think there's a lot of scope for improvement and more collaboration across regions, nationally, and as the UK as a whole, particularly with regards to overcoming some of those barriers, particularly around procurement of specialist vehicles, to make sure that emergency services can deploy trial and prove out the capabilities of EVs in either a controlled environment or ultimately in frontline services. To get that learning on board, there's a real chicken and egg situation at the moment where there's a lot of perceived problems with range, energy consumption when they're driving quickly, charging times, the ability to use the tactics, for example, that the police might use in certain circumstances, and they can't be solved until vehicles are deployed in some form.
Okay, so the other big finding from our report was lack of planning. Nearly 70% of respondents didn't have costed plans to transition their fleets by 2030, which was the date we were looking at for the report. They gave us lots of reasons for this. They had lots of uncertainty, particularly around budgets being available for that 5-year period. But I wondered, what do you think holds back their plans? Is it just money? Is it priorities? Or is there something else? What's stopping the planning happening?
I think the money is a big obvious barrier to planning, just in terms of that uncertainty of how many vehicles or infrastructure or sites you can enable over the next 5 years, for example. Even if that didn't exist, many of the emergency services don't currently have access to the type of data and the information that they would need to develop their own fully costed transition plans. And then I think beyond that, if that information was available, there's also potential issues around having the time and the capabilities to develop those plans as well, and understanding whose responsibility that is within the organisation to actually do that. Is that led by sustainability? Is it led by fleet? Is it led by estates? Is it led by operations or somebody else? Yes. And that's why I think we're seeing a lot of emergency services seeking that external support from the likes of ourselves, but also other expert providers to help them to develop their initial strategies.
Yeah, and I think some of that is about leadership, isn't it? So you talk about the different departments. It's interesting to look at the job titles for people who've already downloaded our report and see that they're mostly fleet people. So at one stage, I think lots and lots of people from the Scottish Fire Service downloaded the report, but they all had fleet in their title. I think this report should be read far beyond the fleet department, by estates, finance, training, and most importantly, by leadership teams. So how do we get the EV transition on the priority list for every leader in the emergency services?
So communication and engagement is obviously really key to this, both within organisations and across the sector as a whole. We see the transition to zero emission vehicles as not the sole responsibility of fleet managers in particular, and you need those other departments to be actively involved from the very beginning in terms of forming strategies and plans through to delivery, especially estates, for obvious reasons, for providing infrastructure and operations as the vehicle users at the end of the day. We had a workshop last week actually up in Yorkshire with an emergency services fleet to help them start to form their team and some initial thinking around the strategies. And one of the things that was really useful there was, first of all, to get representation from some senior leadership in the room, but also to start to reframe the discussion away from just the potential environmental benefits and obviously the policy drivers towards that, to the fact that, first of all, this represents a significant operational risk potentially that needs managing, as emergency services do with their other operational risks at the moment. And the 2035 deadline is fast approaching now, and it's not really acceptable anymore to take a do nothing or do the bare minimum approach, because we could start to see that the market could go ahead of the policy as well.
Yeah, so that's interesting, because that leads us on nicely to something that's happened since the report came out, which is the government has published its response to the consultation on the phasing out of sales of diesel and petrol cars, and something called the ZEV mandate, which we won't get into today, about the vehicle production expectations. You responded to this. I looked at that consultation response and I saw that the NPCC, so the National Police Chiefs Council, the National Police Estates Environment Sustainability Group, Surrey and Sussex Police, West Yorkshire Police, they all responded to this report, to the consultation. But there were no fire services, no ambulance services, and no NHS representatives. And I just wondered why you thought there weren't more responses from, excuse me, from those blue light organisations, given the importance of what was in the consultation. It did have a lot of press, and I saw lots of references to it. So I was quite surprised not to see more emergency services. So I just wondered what you thought about that.
I was very surprised at that as well. I think the people in the groups that you've listed that did respond are well known to be kind of leading in this area, and also obviously represent some of the national interests of some of the individual services as well. I think there could be a few reasons. That I guess there's either potentially a belief that these changes are mostly being driven by policy and the wider automotive industry anyway. So it's, what value is there in responding to a consultation? Potentially just a general lack of awareness within the emergency services sector of the importance of responding to consultations to make sure your views and challenges are heard and acted upon. And we have seen that with some of the changes that have been proposed to the ZEV mandate, as you mentioned. And potentially, again, just not seen as a priority compared to more urgent operational and organizational matters that they might be dealing with as well.
Yes, let's go back to our leadership point, isn't it? It's about where it sits on the priority list. So maybe people who are listening to this will go and have a little look at that consultation and see what the government said and bring themselves up to date, which would be great.
This episode of the Emergency Services Times podcast is sponsored by MSA Safety, proudly supporting emergency services and first responders on the front line. At MSA Safety, protecting first responders isn't just what we do, it's who we are. We work closely with fire and rescue services across the UK to develop and deliver safety solutions designed to meet your ever-evolving needs. That includes MSA Bristol Firefighter PPE, trusted by services across the UK and beyond, shaped through years of collaboration with frontline teams. It also includes our growing investment in innovation and technology, from the connected M1 SCBA modular solution to our agile, fully managed service model that helps keep crews protected and ready to respond. But for us, safety goes beyond equipment. We believe in standing shoulder to shoulder with the people who dedicate their lives to protecting others, whether it's supporting firefighter charities, backing mental health initiatives, or showing up for community events. MSA is proud to be part of the emergency services family. To learn more about our work in the UK and how we're supporting first responders every step of the way, visit www.msasafety.com. With MSA Safety, when you go in, we go in with you.
I'd like to move us on now to talk about special purpose vehicles. So that's also within this report, the government consultation. So the government confirmed it is ending the sale of new petrol and diesel cars from 2030 in that consultation response, with hybrids to be sold until 2035, but some small manufacturers will be exempt. So I thought that was quite interesting. So I wondered whether that was fire engines and fast police cars. And then I discovered there's something called a special purpose vehicle. And I will just read, just for the purposes of this, the consultation response from the government, which said, a large number of respondents to the consultation on EV transition supported exemptions from special purpose vehicles for the 2030 requirements. And they said that we continue to work to define regulatory mechanisms for the transition, including how to define what one of these special vehicles would be. And they're going to do a bit more consultation on it. So I'm sort of slightly paraphrasing there. But I wondered, Carl, what you thought about this idea of fire engines being defined as special purpose vehicles and therefore not being subject to the rules, the same as perhaps a car that you and I would buy. Is that the way forward?
Yeah, I think it's a difficult question to answer, and clearly we're navigating this space very much in the moment. I think the interesting thing for me is obviously what the current position is, that hybrid cars and internal combustion engine vans can still be sold until 2035. So if you look at the majority of emergency services operations with things like police cars, obviously ambulances, and then other healthcare vehicles, that theoretically means that there could be options available for those vehicles all the way up to 2035 that don't require being plugged in and charged and don't need infrastructure solutions. So that could be interesting. And then the HGVs, the fire appliances, are covered not necessarily by those ZEV mandate targets. There is just the commitment to transition to zero emission vehicles from 2035. on those. I think a lot of this is working out the detail. The interesting thing for me, and again, it came up in discussion last Friday with some emergency services colleagues, was the zero emission vehicle mandate targets, the actual percentages of vehicles that have to be sold each year, and the end goal of 2035 have not been changed by successive governments, and those commitments have been there for quite some time now. The way that manufacturers can meet those requirements has changed slightly. The allowance for hybrids or not from 2030 to 2035 has changed slightly as well. And then I think it's interesting to understand what impact an exemption could actually have in practice, because it could allow some more time for emergency services. But we're already hearing people saying that the vehicle manufacturers are changing their product lineups, and they can no longer buy the diesel or the petrol hybrid version of the vehicle that they used to. So it feels like plan A should still very much be to be prepared as a minimum for that transition within the next 10 years or potentially sooner.
So thinking about that then, do you think that the exemption, if the exemption then defines emergency vehicles, whatever that is, and puts that into regulations, which is what's the suggestion within this consultation response, do you think that would stifle the transition to those vehicles? Because it is the wicked problem, potentially. Or do you think that actually what you've just said about the manufacturers, actually they're going that way anyway, so we're kind of just along for the ride? Is that the case? I wonder about stifling the competition.
Yeah, I don't think so. That obviously we've got in the UK, we've got the zero emission vehicle mandate and the plans for phasing out internal combustion engine vehicles. The EU also sets wider greenhouse gas emissions reduction targets, particularly on the heavy duty vehicle suppliers, which are quite difficult to meet without transitioning to a zero emission solution as well. And the emergency services are not the sole customer of many of these organisations, and in fact potentially represent a relatively small volume of vehicle sales each year as well. So I think for me the interesting would be the practicalities of an exemption. What would that mean for someone looking to get a vehicle from a mainstream vehicle supplier going forwards? And will that option still be available to them regardless of what happens with the policy is the real risk of doing nothing.
Okay, and I wonder, given that we saw that there was no fire response to the consultation, that perhaps it's a chance for the National Fire Chiefs Council. We had Glyn Richardson on the webinar, the launch webinar for the report, and he has seen the report and he leads the transport group within the National Fire Chiefs Council to perhaps be part of that consultation, part of that discussion now. Is that an opportunity, do you think?
Yeah, it's a good time to do it. I agree. I think there's some subtle differences between a high mileage police car that a police force might only keep on the fleet for 4 years, for example, compared to a fire appliance that might have a really long life, effectively could be kept for 15 years on the fleet. So it feels like the timescales are inherently a little bit disconnected, because any diesel fire appliances that are purchased today or between now and 2035 could potentially be on those fleets if other regulation and policy doesn't come in to defleet them well into the 2030s or even the 2040s, past the point at which we want to be removing some of these vehicles from the roads.
Yeah, it feels to me like a chance for a spreadsheet of every service, every vehicle appliance, when was it bought, what's its time span, and then to see what's the size of the problem. I think that would be really interesting. I don't know if everybody's doing that, but that seems like a good way forward for me. Let's move on now. We're going to talk about charging infrastructure in the last section of this podcast discussion. We didn't ask questions about infrastructure in our FOI request, but lots of responses referred to it. And in our discussion with leads in fire, police and ambulance, it comes up, during the discussion, it came up a lot. So I'm just going to ask you to just explain quickly for us, what are the problems with installing charging infrastructure? Why is it the thing that seems to be stalling the rollout of electric vehicles in the emergency services?
So I guess the short answer is there are lots of potential problems. This is a really challenging area. I think a lot of emphasis has been placed on vehicles to date, but that is quickly shifting to infrastructure. Firstly, it's really difficult to plan and optimize the infrastructure particularly of response vehicles, without first understanding your journey patterns in significant detail and the charging requirements of your vehicles. And that requires two things: good data in the first place, which not all emergency services may have, and then the ability to use that data in a useful way. Even once you've done that, there's no right or wrong solution necessarily. There's no single way of solving the charging strategy of these vehicles. How do you do it? When do you do it? Where do you do it? Do you do it at stations? Do you do it on the public network? Do you do it at other people's stations or depots? Do you do it over a mixture of all three? What charging infrastructure do you need? Is it low power, high power, a mix of charging solutions to meet those requirements? And then how do you scale that from one or two vehicles to a fleet? And then thirdly, most ambulance, fire and police stations simply don't have the power available, or the space available in some cases, to be able to charge fleets of electric vehicles. And grid upgrades in particular can be really time consuming and expensive. So there's lots of practical considerations. There's other things like whether you own your own site or you lease it from somebody else, how you insure sites and vehicles when you transition to EVs. And then the obvious challenges around the additional capital cost required for all of that infrastructure if you're going to install it yourself, or the additional revenue costs that might be required if you're going to use somebody else's infrastructure as well.
Goodness,
so it's a very
there's a lot to it. Yeah, I can see that.
area.
And when you're going into services, you talked about something that you've been recently to have these discussions. Do you have like a kind of a template, a kind of go through all of that to work out where the baseline is for an organisation to allow them to then work out where to put their time and effort? Is that how that works?
Yeah, definitely. I think there's a real need. Simple things like checklists can be really useful for these organisations that can understand, as you say, what the steps are to go through that decision-making process, but then also having the tools and the information to be able to plan that in the right way. And what we'd like to increasingly see is those resources put into the hands of the decision makers rather into the hands of consultants like ourselves. And that's a real challenge to get that information and that training across.
Yes, and I wonder if individual services are being proactive in coming to organisations like yours to say, "Can you help us?" Should there not be a national approach?
I think certainly a nationally consistent approach to guidance and best practice makes a lot of sense. And then also for things like collaboration for any public sector charging hubs or similar types of solutions as well to avoid that overspend. But it's really difficult. There is an inertia to overcome to get that coordination going. And that doesn't just apply to this specific challenge. I think that is a broader sector problem as well.
So if the national approach is perhaps a bit too tricky, what about some joining up at a local or regional level? So we see police, fire and ambulance often in cities relatively close to each other. You have a fire station, a police station, an ambulance station, and yet all three of them potentially are looking individually at their charging infrastructure. How do we join up between the emergency services?
Yeah, I think we can, we are seeing that local collaboration starting to happen, but that is on them to do that. Essentially, it's about being on the front foot from that. So I think, greater leadership at a political level, both regionally and locally, will certainly help, potentially through things like areas where you've got elected mayors or police, fire and crime commissioners. And as we see more kind of devolved responsibility through combined authorities for transport, that group should really have a role to play to encourage that collaboration across the wider public estate. At the same time, there's also some fantastic self-organised emergency services groups. I think you mentioned the Emergency Services Environmental Sustainability Group, for example, which is doing some great work to find solutions to these problems, not just talk about them, and then also share that practice with one another as well.
Yes, that's right. So that's the work of Mick Johnson, who is from Cheshire Fire and Police. He straddles both organisations, and yes, you're right. He does a great job in bringing all of those people together to have these discussions. And he and many of the members of that were involved in the report as well, which was great to see. So it just brings me finally to talk to you about money. What do you think emergency services need to do to secure budgets to switch to EVs?
So the first thing they can do, which is in their own control, I guess, is to develop a full and detailed understanding of their specific fleet transition costs, and that needs to cover everything from the upfront cost of the vehicles the infrastructure and any grid or enabling works that they need to do at their stations. But then also kind of making sure that they are making decisions based on a more total cost of ownership basis, so that they can start to recognize some of those running cost savings across their fleets. And they can be really significant. So because response vehicles do high mileages, they use a lot of fuel, you can potentially see running costs of up to 50% or more for a well-utilized vehicle, which could equate to hundreds of thousands of pounds a year or millions over the life of the vehicle as well. But then timing and optimization are key to that as well. So making sure that sequencing makes sense, and they're procuring vehicles when it is most cost effective to do so as well, and not over specifying vehicles, infrastructure and power supply for the worst case scenarios. Despite all that, capital funding remains a huge challenge for all emergency services, so all three within the sector, but all individuals as well. So there would be significant benefit, I think, from a more centrally funded source of capital funding to accelerate some of these plans. In a lot of cases, the solutions are available, and we could be making faster progress if organisations had the capability, capacity and funding to do so.
Yes, and with the promise of new, perhaps 3-year settlements, maybe, fingers crossed, for public sector bodies, then maybe capital could be part of that. That would be the ideal, wouldn't it? To have a certainty to allow for that planning, to allow to know how you can join it, how you can get those kinds of goals. And as you say, that whole life cost, rather than thinking about it as individual components. So I think that's helpful for people to go away and think about. So as we wrap up now, I'm going to ask you, as I do with our webinars, to give us one piece of advice you'd like our podcast listeners to go away and think about or discuss, over a cup of tea with a colleague. So what is the one piece of advice you'd give to our listeners to start that conversation?
I struggle to get only one, so I have several, but I'll keep them short. I think we've spoken about many of them today, actually, so I think getting buy-in from your senior leadership team, but also those that will be most impacted by the change, which is typically vehicle users and frontline operational staff. Making sure that you collect and use data to make well-informed decisions, and then just being open-minded to change. We might need to change how we work. We might need to innovate to find solutions. So going through that process of testing, learning, improving continuously is really delivering a lot of benefits for those that are further ahead.
Great. So plenty to go and have a conversation. Maybe need a biscuit to go with that one. So thank you very much for that. What a great conversation. Thank you, Carl. Appreciate your time today.
No problem. Thank you very much.
And thank you for joining us. And we will see you again, maybe at the show. I'm going to try and get to Cenex Expo as well, which would be great. If you and I can talk about this report, that'd be fabulous. But just listening to say thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Catherine.
Thanks for listening, and thanks to Tom St. John for expertly producing this episode. If you like this episode, then be sure to check out other conversations with leaders in this season of For Every Response, sponsored by MSA Safety. Share the link and subscribe to receive updates on new episodes from us here at Emergency Services Times.